seriously. And the second part of his story we suspended. Only those who were there will ever know meant that we had to listen acutely and attentively to the voices of survivors who come close to being able to tell it. And we don't know whether they can or cannot tell the story until we what? Try to tell the story using their voices and hearing their words, their silence, what they say and what they don't say. We ran into a very early problem. And this problem was philosophical, couldn't be solved, and then we ended up solving it in a very particular way. Who were the victims of the Holocaust? And the simple answer is, for most people, the question of the victims of the Holocaust are Jews. The question, though, is Jews are only Jews, or were there other people who saw themselves as victims of Nazism and now wanted to opt for that status of victims of the Holocaust? Could we build in Washington while there are people who felt left out of the story? And perhaps my unique contribution to this was to say that if you dealt that the tension between those who wanted Holocaust only and Jews only, and the uniqueness of the Holocaust to Jews alone, and the story of those who wanted to include everybody could be meshed. Because how do you tell what is unique about the fate of the Jews without understanding the role of all the other victims of Nazism? Let me give you a simple series of examples. If you want to talk about the use of gas chambers, the symbol of the Holocaust, the reason it's called the Holocaust, the origin of gas chambers has to do with the murder of the handicapped. The first to be gassed were mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally distraught, congenitally ill Germans. And it was for them that the gas chamber first was developed. There's a signed order by Adolf Hitler. So you can't talk about the gassing of Jews without talking first and including what happened to these people in Germany who were called a life unworthy of living, useless eaters, people who consume our resources, and who were killed by doctors in a medicalized process, which also developed the phenomenon of the desk killer, meaning that you filled out a form and the end result was that people died. You didn't have to strangle them, you didn't have to shoot them, you didn't have to go after them directly. So if you want to talk about gassing and its origin, you must include those who died, who were murdered in this, and you also should include the fact that that process ended because the German public protested. Because if you have a kid who's institutionalized, you don't care for that kid less, you care for that kid more. If your kid who's institutionalized died, the first person you speak to is somebody else whose kid was institutionalized. When you hear that 2 died, you have a problem. When you hear that 3 died, you have a catastrophe. When you hear that 5 died, you have a policy. And therefore, that was stopped by public protest later on when it came to the killing of the Jews by gas. Public protest was what? Mute and silence. How do you speak about the role of Jews who were victims not because of what they did, but because of the fact that they were Jews, without understanding the difference between what happened to Jews and what happened to political dissidents and social democrats, what happened to communists and what happened to people who opposed Nazism? One group was victimized for what they did, the other group was victimized for what they were. How do you talk about the involuntary nature of persecution without comparing what happened to the Jews to the fate of Jehovah's Witnesses? Jehovah's Witnesses were killed or were victimized not because of what they did, but because of what they refused to do. They would not register for the draft, they would not say Heil Hitler, they would not swear allegiance to the German state, and they would not stop proselytizing. And they could get out of the camp if they signed a form saying, I renounce Jehovah's Witness, and in one sense, I will no longer proselytize. And one of the things when I speak to the Jehovah's Witnesses groups, I say that if I had been a Jehovah's Witness, I would have signed that form. Because I did not think the Nazis were inhabitants of a common moral universe where my word to them would count for anything. And I would not have wanted to give them the opportunity to victimize me or victimize any of my group. I would just sign it and say if they're not worthy of my keeping my word. And then they get into a debate, but we would have betrayed our word for God to God. And I said God would have understood. And in one sense, you would have protected the Nazis from deeper sin by walking the hell out of there. But if you want to describe the involuntary nature of Jewish victimization, begin to say that Jews who converted were victimized, Jews whose parents converted were victimized, and contrast that for a moment. How do you explain the nature of the role of Jews without seeing the only other group that was victimized, the Gypsies? But it never was, their elimination was not significant to the future of the Nazi universe. They were regarded as an irritant, not a cancer. And consequently, in certain countries it became a priority, in other countries it didn't become a priority. When the war took a bad turn, they changed their policy. So the only way you could express the uniqueness of the Jewish faith is not by exclusion, but by inclusion. And inclusion in a way that everybody would regard as fair and open and proper and respectful. And we succeeded in doing that, so much so that every other institution since then has taken exactly the same role. The New York Museum does it the same way. Yad Vashem does it the same way. Every institution describes the multiple nature of victimization in all sorts of ways. How powerful do you make the exhibition? And part of what you have to be fearful of is walking the very thin line between a chamber of horrors and something that is other than a chamber of horrors that allows you to get deeper and deeper into the story. There's a movie opening tomorrow in New York and an opening today in New York and Los Angeles called In Darkness. It's a Polish film but done by the woman who did Europa. Very powerful film. And I spoke on the film night before last. And I said, there's one problem with the film. It's like some of you are old enough to remember the dentist chair when the dentist chair had a slow drill. It's like going to the dentist and the slow drill never lets up. And what happens to you when the slow drill never lets up? You become numb. You shut down, you become numb. And the worst thing the dentist could do for you at that moment is to take the drill out and say, rest a while, and then we'll get back to the rest of it, because you could anticipate the torture you were about to face. So when you present something that is enormously powerful without let-up, without nuance, without punctuation, you present something that ultimately numbs the senses. If you do it in a different way, you begin to create a total experience. We had a series of issues. One of them is going to be in a film very shortly. Somebody wanted to give us, or wanted us to purchase, and ultimately wanted to give us an artifact that was the lampshade that was made for Ilse Koch. And I had a decision to make, and what I found worked as good policy is I made the decision and then asked people, this is what I intend to do, what do you think about it? And I said, A, the museum shouldn't buy it, because we don't want to increase the market in Nazi memorabilia and increase the prices in Nazi memorabilia. But if somebody were to buy it and give it to us, we would receive it as evidence but never display it. Too ghoulish. How do you not victimize people who are victimized? How do you not victimize them a second time? there are certain things that even if they happened, and they did, should not necessarily be seen. Then we came to an interesting thing because somebody gave us a tremendous artifact. The Poles gave us the artifact of human hair that's on display in Auschwitz. And human hair became for us a metaphor of how much of vulnerability do you want to show. At Auschwitz and other camps, what the Nazis did was to essentially recycle the human being. They took the hair from your head and the hair from your body parts. They bound it, they used it as detonators, they used it as insulators. Here, for those of us who are going bald, we understand that it's a great insulator. They used it as detonators, they even used it to create fabric. When Auschwitz was liberated, there was 7 tons of human hair that had been collected in the last several weeks. We had human hair, and the question then became, do we take it or not? We held a staff meeting. The staff meeting was one of the most intense staff meetings I've ever attended. The debate went something like this. If you were creating a museum of rape, you wouldn't show rape. Oh yes, you would. I know I've been raped. You got to face it. You got to show it, etc. And this clearly became a metaphor for how much vulnerability do you want to show. I then did something that set the staff meeting, which had been raucous, into cataclysm. I said, look, I've listened to everybody, and the issue is a very interesting issue. The issue is that hair is an enormously powerful artifact. The question that we have as a museum staff is the artifact so powerful that in one sense we can not display it because it overwhelms, and we therefore will not use it as a vehicle to understand and to experience and to see? Or is it an artifact whose power we can use in order to tell the story we want to tell? And that's a challenge to us as museum makers on how to do it. In the same way, for example, if you're in karate and somebody comes at you in power with a very powerful move, the question is, how do you transform that power and use it as energy instead of merely absorbing it and getting it and feeling it? So we ended up with that issue, and we made a decision we were going to use it. And then what happened is the 2 women who were survivors said that could be my hair, and I have the right to say no. And there was an interesting debate between young and old, and debate between genders. Men tended to feel better about using their hair than women, and younger people felt it was appropriate to face that vulnerability. But in the end, it was the human story of our own survivors. We felt at that point that we couldn't, and if it were up to me, and it's not up to me, the day after the last of those survivors died, the hair would go in, because the picture of the hair is not powerful. The nature of the hair is really enormously powerful. And part of that is the question of how do you display it. We then had another issue in Washington which led again to creativity. Not mine, so I can speak in praise of those who did it. We had an enormous problem. How do you present the magnitude of loss? If you present piles of dead bodies, which is the one way in which you do it, piles of dead bodies people would withdraw from, would retreat from. Somebody came up with a very interesting idea, which is that you show presence and they sense absence. We then came across a collection of the pictures of the village of Ishishki, collected by my distinguished colleague and friend Yafa Eliyahu. And then somebody came up with the idea that nowhere in the museum do we use vertical space, But if we use vertical space, this one place, we can go through an exhibition of the pictures of everybody from one entire community alive. At the first time they present people, the first time you go through, they present the sense of people who are potentially vulnerable to death. And the second time, you see presence, but you know absence. You see them, but you understand that everybody you've seen is dead. And it soars 64 feet and 28 feet square, person by person, image by image. And it's the type of pictures that had a tremendous power because we could have taken them from anybody's living room. Who doesn't have a picture of their kid on their first bicycle? Who doesn't have a picture of them with their first car? Who doesn't have a picture of kids on an outing at the beach? Who doesn't have a picture of somebody, little kid standing on a chair in a little bit of a Navy uniform like a little Lord Fauntleroy? Who doesn't have a picture of, well, we don't today, thank God, of kids smoking cigarettes in a college dorm, of all that experiences. So we decided that the best way to show magnitude is to show presence and let the visitor sense absence. Meaning make the visitor work with the idea that you presented in such a way. Now, everybody who deals with an event understands that certain editing takes place. If you're building in Washington, you must deal with the government role. We underplayed the role of churches. We underplayed the role of Christianity. If I were building in a different context, I would build with a great understanding of that, but you can't build in Washington without dealing with government and the power of government and the irresponsibility of government not responding. And we knew the museum began to work when people chose it as a locale, as an important locale for what? For making a statement about the genocide that was then taking place in Bosnia, for later making a statement about the genocide that was taking place in Rwanda, and as organizing activities on behalf of the combating the genocide in Darfur, with the idea that all of a sudden the museum became a symbolic space. So part of what you had to do is you have to selectively, in such a way, edit, because you can't create, and this is tough because I write encyclopedias and encyclopedia, can't create an encyclopedia on a wall. You can't do everything, and again, my frustration is I'd love to be able to do everything. My biggest frustration when I write the text in this, and Jonathan, who's a newspaperman, will know, is that I'm given 100 words to write it. My first draft, which is quick, is 1,000 words. That takes an hour. Getting 1,000 words into 100 words, that takes a week. Meaning it's much easier, and students don't realize this after a while, because students are afraid of the empty space. The question becomes, how do you write with small space? And that becomes much more difficult. Winston Churchill once was asked, how long would it take you to give a 3-hour speech? He said, let's go. And a 3-minute speech, he said, that will take me 3 weeks. To write briefly becomes important, and to convey it all. That's some of what we faced in Washington. Let me give you a couple of other examples of stuff we struggle with, because I've not only created in Washington. Let me share a little bit more of some of the problems, and then we'll give it a question of answers. A question and answer time. I'm creating a museum in Macedonia. And in Macedonia, you have a different and a very interesting thing, because part of what we decided to do in Macedonia is we decided that we would have to begin to talk about the role of Jews in Macedonia. And the other principle we always had, which we short-circuited, failed in Washington, which New York does a majestic job of doing in New York, which we did far better in a museum we did in Skokie, is the moral principle that before they were victims, we have to see them as people. And that is, we really have to describe the world before. Because if all you see is Jews as skeletal victims, you don't understand what was lost. So what we have, which is very interesting in Macedonia, is we begin with the remnant of the oldest synagogue located out of the land of the state of Israel, the land of Israel, which is the 3rd century before the synagogue floor that we have in Stovia, Macedonia. To give you a sense of Jews being in Macedonia for that long time. We also then deal with something very interesting, which is the Jews in Macedonia came from Spain. And in fact, the synagogues of Macedonia were called by the name of the synagogues of Spain. And the very interesting thing about not only the synagogues of Macedonia, but the language the Jews spoke was Ladino language. And there was a borderless Jewish Ladino language of all Spanish exiles, which didn't know the changes of borders between Macedonia and Yugoslavia, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and the like, and the difference between Greece and Yugoslavia. So we present that, and then we have an incredible artifact that is deserving of its all. I don't know how many of you know about the story of the Sarajevo Haggadah. Sarajevo Haggadah was commissioned in 1354 in Spain. It came over with a Jewish family that was escaping Spain and coming to the Balkans. And it survived attempts to find it and destroy it in World War I, during the Holocaust, and then during the genocide that was taking place in Bosnia. And here you have a 1354 illuminated manuscript that, in a very deep and very profound sense, is the story of Jewish freedom. But the document tells the story of Jewish freedom, which is the story of the Haggadah. But the document itself is what? Is the example of the enduring quality of people who take with them that which they cherish the most, who hide it. And it was hidden, ironically, it was saved by a Christian during World War I, by a Muslim during World War II, by a town during the genocide in Bosnia. And here you have a document, so we will travel with that document all the way through, not only a document, but a visual document that tells the story where the artifact itself has multiple resonances and tells it. And then what you have in Macedonia, which you don't have in Macedonia, the entire Holocaust took place within a 4-week period. Jews were assembled on March 11th. They were deported from their homes, sent to a place called Monopol, which was a ghetto. And within 3 weeks, 7,144 Jews were killed, sent to Treblinka, deported, sent to Treblinka. Nobody who boarded the train survived. Creates a problem. How do you hear the voices of survivors? And that's much more problematic there, because you don't have the remnant that survived. And the only people you have who were in Monopol were 3 forms of people who were not killed: doctors, pharmacists, because there were too many Jewish doctors to leave Macedonia without physicians and without pharmacists, and foreign nationals who had kept their Spanish passports. And therefore we don't have the voice of total destruction, because nobody returned. So you tell the story of the few who escaped, either by who escaped early, the physicians and the pharmacists, and then what happened when they found out that Treblinka was Treblinka and none. When we did a museum in Skokie, we had a principle of localization. Localization means we used only survivor testimony from Chicagoland. Meaning that we wanted people to understand these were our neighbors, these were our friends. And they lived among us. And it's remarkable to see what happens to a kid who realizes that, 50 years ago, sitting next to my father could have been a Holocaust survivor who was 11 years old or 7 years old getting his first education after having been through that. I once taught at Georgetown in 1983, and I used to have my students adopt the survivor's testimony as theirs. And one young lady comes up to me and says, "Can I tell my story?" And like an idiot, I said, "What's your story?" Well, she had been in Cambodia. So I had her tell her story, and instead of taking 1 week, it took 3 weeks. And my students really got an education that semester because we had thrown out the curriculum and we really learned something in a very deep way. And I got the ultimate reward for that about 11 years later when I was in Rwanda. And I came back and I was in Rwanda, and in Rwanda what I was doing was advising the government how to bury their dead but document it so there would be no denial. Come back to the hotel one night and I walk in, a beautiful young blonde lady puts her arms around me and kisses me on both cheeks. That doesn't happen to me often. Well, let me say it doesn't happen to me often enough. And I vaguely recognize her, and she says, "Because of you, I stayed." Put her in context, she had been in that course. She then had become a doctor. She was with a Doctor Without Borders. And she said, "What did I learn in that class? I learned in that class not to play it safe, but to stay there and take the risks that I have to take." And she said, "I want something from you," and I felt like, whatever you want, it's yours. She said, "You have to go back and tell my parents why I stayed. Because they're livid that I put my life in danger." And I said I would, and I did. But again, part of what you have to understand is the power of localization. When you're sitting next to a beautiful young lady whom you'd like to ask out on a date, and you find out she is a survivor of Rwanda, you're shaken to your absolute core, especially when you hear the story. What's the point? Last point I want to make, and then we'll take questions. How does an institution present controversy without itself being controversial? And that's a very difficult problem to solve. You need a combination of several things. You need integrity. You need courage. And integrity is a sense of, this is why we handle the problem this way. And reasonable people can judge it that we handled right, but there was a method to what seems to be our madness. You need balance and fairness. So, for example, we were able to present a dialogue between Daniel Goldhagen and Christopher Browning when Goldhagen came out with his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which was attacking Browning. But anybody who went there said that both sides got an equal shot. The way in which you presented the controversy said that the museum was the locus of controversy without itself being the subject of controversy. There's a tendency to look to the Holocaust for triumphalism of some sort. Zionists looked at the Holocaust as a way of showing Zionist triumphalism, only they understood what was really happening, they did something about it. Religious Jews sometimes are in triumphalism. This was a matter of sacred, the power of Judaism and of Jews to withstand